capture from the club's surveillance tapes. They woke Caleb up to show him the photograph. Andrew looked over his shoulder, curious to see the man Caleb had picked up at the bar, the one they suspected of poisoning him, and he felt the strongest burst of jealousy. The guy was young and blonde, gorgeous. He'd been wearing nothing but leather pants, and with the rest of his styling, perfect hair, dark eyeliner, Andrew didn't think he compared at all. Caleb seemed more embarrassed about it than anything else, especially since his father had come into the room to see the photo and hear Caleb's confirmation. Once Caleb agreed that they'd found the man he'd gone into the bathroom with that night, Alphonse and the bodyguards had retreated from the room to begin the search. Andrew had forced the image from his mind and tried to stay professional. Caleb gave Andrew the strangest look and gestured him over. "Do you need something?" "I need you not to look at me like I'm scum." Andrew flinched and looked away. "I don't think you're scum." "It didn't mean anything, Andrew. He was just some random hookup in a bar. I don't even remember his name. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Caleb grumbled under his breath before forcing himself into a sitting position. Andrew didn't offer to help this time. He hated that he was letting this impact him so deeply. Who was he to say anything about who Caleb spent time with, especially before they'd even met? It was ridiculous and childish, but Andrew couldn't seem to force the big green monster back into his cage. "I don't normally do stuff like that. I was lonely. It's hard to meet people when you have a secret as big as mine. And don't get me started on my father's family. My uncle and cousin are waiting for the opportunity to put me out on my ass because of my weakness." Weakness? It was the first time Caleb had mentioned anyone other than his father or the bodyguards. Andrew couldn't help his curiosity. "They think being gay is some kind of crime. I'm supposed to be alpha one day, after my dad gets older. Since I can't carry on the line, they don't think I should qualify. It's ridiculous and old-fashioned, but there it is. If they knew about this, God, Pop would never hear the end of it." As he spoke, Caleb paled further, and his breath began to come in short gasps. Andrew gave himself a mental slap and rushed to Caleb's side. "Don't worry about it. We're going to get you better, and then they can go fuck themselves." Caleb smiled at him. "I don't want you to think badly of me." "I don't. Not really. I'm more jealous than anything, and yes, I know it's ridiculous. Nah, it just means you fit right in around here. I don't want to know about your past relationships. I'd have to kill some asshole who'd hurt you, and then where would we be?" Andrew grinned as he reached over and squeezed Caleb's arm. "You need rest. We're getting closer to an answer. Your dad and the guys will find this jerk from the club and find out what he did to you." "I hope so." Andrew walked up the steps to his apartment with little spring in his step. After several more days of illness, Caleb's condition wasn't improving. Well, Alphonse thought it was. Caleb had moments of his wolf trying to surface over the past few days, normally in Andrew's presence. There hadn't been any other injuries to Andrew, which he counted as a win. In the loss column were the numbers. The numbers didn't lie, even though Alphonse was convinced the emergence of Caleb's wolf would make everything better. Caleb grew weaker with each passing day. His blood pressure and pulse rate were across the board, but the lows were lower and the highs were higher. Andrew didn't know much about shifters, but he sensed a desperation in Caleb's other side that didn't sit well with him. It was as if the wolf knew he was dying. It didn't give Andrew very much confidence, especially considering they still hadn't found the missing twink. He unlocked the door to his apartment and dropped his bag onto the floor. His spine clenched, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something told him to leave. This sudden urge that burst through him and told him he was in danger. His gaze darted around the room. He wasn't alone. His brother sat in one of the blue side chairs Andrew never used unless company was over. Beside him stood two of the most intimidating men Andrew had ever seen. Danny stared at him through wide blue eyes. His face was pale, and little beads of sweat gathered around his forehead. His normally perfectly styled blonde curls were in wild disarray. That in itself frightened Andrew more than anything. Danny took immense pride in his appearance and usually had a haughty expression, one of those you can't mess with me faces. He held that outer shell in place, even when he was dead wrong and knew it. Not this time. His brother was clearly terrified. Andrew took a step back, and one of the goons drew a gun and placed it to Danny's head. You might as well not try anything. I'll have Danny's brains on the floor before you can blink, and I doubt you can outrun my second bullet. Andrew froze, and the guy smiled. Hey, at least you're a better listener than your brother here. What do you want? Andrew hated that his voice trembled, but couldn't fight the knowledge that nothing about to happen would be good in any way. Well now, what I really want is my money. Danny here assured me that he could get it from you. But that turned out to be a lie, didn't it, Danny boy? With that, he slapped Danny across the face. Danny's head jerked to the side, and blood began to trickle from his nose. Don't! Andrew stepped forward with his hand outstretched, but goon number 2 turned his gun on Andrew. Now, I don't think you want to try anything. Andrew did want to try something, but he had no idea what. Anything to get the two of them out of this situation. The lead goon approached and ran the muzzle of his gun over Andrew's cheek. You might as well stop thinking about it, pretty boy. I've been doing this for a long time. I have no trouble making sure you do what I want. And if you don't, well, then I'll have no trouble hurting you. Or your brother. I got it! Andrew stepped away from the cold metal on his face with a shudder. Good. Now, Danny here told me something really interesting about you. I think you and I might come to an understanding yet. Just tell me what you want. Andrew didn't even see the fist coming. It slammed into his stomach and left him hunched over and coughing. Danny cried out and was quickly backhanded for his trouble. I don't like that tone, pretty. As for what I want, well, that has to do with your new job. Danny tells me you're working for the DiMartinos. He wasn't lying, was he? Andrew tried to stand up again, but the pain radiating through his body had him wincing and leaning forward onto his knees. No, he wasn't lying. Good boy. Then your job is easy. I need some information on how that house of theirs is laid out, and you're going to get it for me. Andrew forced himself to stand, one arm crossed protectively across the throbbing stomach. Why? He wished he'd kept his mouth shut when the fist landed across his jaw. He fell back onto the floor and covered his face with his hand. Your job isn't to ask questions. You do what you're told, and you and Danny will be just fine. Andrew had no idea what they were after, but refusing wasn't an option. Fine, I got it. Just tell me what you need, and I'll get it for you. I was hoping you'd see it my way. The guy knelt down next to him and ran his hand over Andrew's head. The layout, and where that bastard DiMartino sleeps. Think you can manage that for me? Andrew nodded, and the guy's fist closed into his hair. He jerked Andrew's head back and grinned. Now, I'm going to hold on to Danny boy here until you get me what I need. Otherwise, I'll make sure you both wind up in as many pieces as I can cut off. Capiche? Andrew nodded again. The grip in his hair tightened, and Andrew was forced to his feet. Another blow to his stomach, and Andrew cried out and threw up. The guy jumped out of the way in time to avoid the mess. Hate it when that happens. He laughed. You have 48 hours. I'll be in touch. They grabbed Danny by his arms and dragged him out of the room. Danny sent him a beseeching glance, and Andrew nodded in reply. Yeah, he'd figure out how to get them out of this mess. He hated it, but he would do it. With another coughing breath, he closed the door to his apartment. They'd left it standing wide open when they left. His knees gave out, and Andrew slid to the floor with a choked cry. Staring across the room, Andrew's gaze locked on the phone. All it would take was a phone call to Alphonse. Surely any man who needed bodyguards would know how to get around a couple of thugs who were after him. Andrew dropped his head to his knees as the throbbing in his face and stomach began to amplify. All he had to do was confess his brother's sins and let the professionals handle it. The question was whether Alphonse would be willing to let Danny and Andrew take the fall in order to protect his family. Considering the magnitude of their secret, Andrew couldn't quite bring himself to believe that the DiMartinos would balk at allowing a couple of brothers to disappear in order to keep their family safe. Chapter 5. Andrew sat at his kitchen table with a coffee mug in one hand and an ice pack in the other. Crumbs were all that remained of the buttered toast he'd managed to force past his swollen jaw. He called in sick to work, not wanting Caleb or Alphonse to see him in this condition. They would see the purple and green bruises and demand to know what had happened. What could he tell them? He glanced down at his bruised abdomen and sighed. At least that one he could cover with his shirt. His face, not so much. Fortunately, the agency Andrew worked for would handle the actual call to the DeMartinos. He called his manager, Sherry, earlier. Andrew was glad he would be able to avoid their questions for at least a day. Yesterday's attack rolled through his mind. How would he get the information the goons had demanded? And would he actually be able to do it? To betray Alphonse and Caleb that way? Who was he fooling? Andrew would never betray Caleb, but he had to get the information to the thugs who had his brother. The easiest answer seemed to be to tell the DeMartinos what happened and let them handle the threat. But what if they abandoned Danny to his fate? Andrew's head swam. He pushed the plate to the side and laid his head on the table. The ice pack had his jaw aching even more than it had after the initial strike. 20 minutes on, 20 off, and maybe the swelling would be reduced enough that no one would notice when he went back to work tomorrow. Bam, bam, bam. A pounding series of knocks on his door startled Andrew so much he jerked. His bruised stomach protested, and Andrew fought another wave of nausea. The panic set in. What if they'd come back? He did his best to tiptoe over to the door and look out through the peephole. Bam, bam, bam. Andrew, open the door. Oh, hell, Caleb and Monty. Andrew double-checked that the security chain was fastened and opened the door. He kept the bruised portion of his face hidden. Caleb, what are you doing here? I came to find out what's wrong with you. You called in sick. You were fine yesterday. Open the door. Shit. I don't think that's such a good idea, Caleb. I'm not feeling well, and I don't want you to catch something. Caleb growled, and his eyes changed to that deep amber that signaled an impending shift. Open the damn door! Andrew closed the door and slid the chain from its hook. The last thing he needed was a half-shifted wolf on his front stoop. Caleb pushed the door open as soon as Andrew had the chain free. His expression went from concern to fierce anger in a second. Who hurt you? Andrew shrugged. I'm fine. I didn't want you to see me like this. Caleb lifted his hand to Andrew's face, stroked over the bruise gently. You didn't answer my question. It doesn't matter. Caleb growled again. It does, and you will tell me who did this to you. Was it your brother? Something in Andrew's expression must have given away part of the story, because Caleb's hands began to shift into claws. He pulled his fingers away from Andrew's face. I'll rip him to shreds. It wasn't Danny. Look. I really don't want to talk about this. Caleb's gaze drifted down Andrew's torso to the purple and red bruising on his side. His eyes glowed, the deepest amber Andrew had seen yet. Monty cleared his throat. Caleb, I think we should head back. I told you this was a bad idea. The change came over Caleb. He snarled, then howled. His body began to contort. Jed's demonstration of his shift had been nothing compared to this. Where the bodyguard's change flowed smoothly over him, Caleb's change was a fight. Andrew could see the power behind it, the force of Caleb's wolf demanding to be set free. Andrew tried to step back, as he had been warned, but Caleb pinned him with his gaze. Andrew froze, looked down and away. Caleb howled again. Monty slammed the door shut and began muttering under his breath. Andrew didn't know where to look. He could see Caleb's feet from his downward gaze, let his eyes drift up even as Caleb began to melt into his wolf form. Within a minute, a large black and gray wolf stood surrounded by a tangle of clothes where Caleb had been moments before.